Hi everyone, thanks for joining my talk on CSS layout and the web layout revolution. Thanks for taking time in these rather unusual circumstances, but let's hope that you enjoy the talk. Okay, my talk is called Farewell Bootstrap and Other Tales from the Web Layout Revolution. And I'll be talking about how CSS and HTML layouts have changed over the years and run through some of the new tools that we have at our disposal to make layouts a lot easier than it has been in the past. A little bit about me. I am, sorry, I need to get this working. Okay. I'm head of design and front end at a company called NML, and we largely build financial services software for investment companies. And I head up all design and front end that goes into building our products. I'm also involved quite a lot in community initiatives as part of FEDSA, or the Front-End Developers of South Africa, which is a non-profit that we formed to bring meetups under one umbrella. And we've got some exciting things planned for the rest of the year that we will be announcing in the ZA Tech channel. Okay, so enough about me. Let's get into the talk. So I'm going to start off by talking about layout on the web and just giving a history on where we've come from, so we can see how the landscape has changed over the last 2 decades or so, and then later on we'll go into the new CSS properties we have that make layout so much easier. So in 1991 there was only one website. You may have seen it. It was at CERN in Switzerland. It was built by Tim Berners-Lee, and it looked like this. Just a lot of text and some HTML tags and nothing else. And this is the first kind of layout that we ever had on the web, and it is commonly referred to as flow layout. And flow layout is really block and inline level HTML content, and in flow layout, block level content flows from top to bottom. We can also refer to other terms here, which is phrasing and flow content. So phrasing content is usually visible. It's something like an image or something that's inline, like a link, a paragraph, a list, something like that. Whereas flow content is usually display block, and it relates to semantics of the HTML layout that we don't necessarily see. So for example, display row, table row on a table, or display block on a block level element. These are not things that we necessarily see on the screen, but they're there to create flow. So in that very first website, we are just purely looking at flow layout, and we have phrasing and flow content. That is block and inline level elements. And if you go to look at the source of that page, which is available on the CERN website, you'll see that it's largely made of definition lists. And you'll notice the blue links, which is still the default color that we actually have for links on the web. Right, so that was in 1991, and the web was very much still a closed system. It was only really at academic institutions, but that changed fairly quickly. But trawling around the Web Design Museum, which is an interesting site to go and have a look at, and moving to the year 1994, we see no real difference in what we are doing in terms of layout. The only difference here is that images have been introduced, and we have some really unpleasant looking GIFs that were made in an early version of Photoshop, no doubt. And those are now, that's really as far as layout has progressed at this time. So the first kind of way when people started wanting to do layouts on the web, it was largely influenced by print. And to that end, HTML tables were the first kind of thing that was used for layout. And this meant that we forced sites into perfect configurations using HTML data tables. And this we started to see also around 1994, and in a development version of a browser called Mosaic, which was to become Netscape later on, but there was no CSS or any styling of any kind at this time. And we had visual design hacks that were prioritized over the semantic web. And those visual design hacks just changed over the years. We never really had a semantic way of doing layout, as you'll see a bit later. And, we used all sorts of things to force items into place on the screen, such as spacer GIFs. Some of you might remember those, 1 pixel by 1 pixel transparent GIFs that we used to move elements left, right, up and down, and so on in the actual HTML. It was very messy. So we might write something like this, for example, a table with some table rows and tags. Note everything's in uppercase, as was the kind of standard practice at that time. I won't go into why, that's for another talk. But any color or anything that we needed to do, we had to insert as an attribute within an actual HTML tag. So in this case, we are setting a background color, a border size, a border color light, border color dark, a width, and then an alignment property of center. And if you note our font around welcome to my homepage, we had a tag called font where we would specify a size, and we had 6 ways to do that, 1 to 6, which later became small, large, extra large, etc. Color, red, and face equals Arial. And at this time, again, we only had the kind of web-safe fonts that we had for a long time to use to add any design elements to our pages and screens. So that little bit of HTML there gave us this, beautiful layout and design. And you can see what a pain it was just to do something as horrible as that. That's not to say that people didn't utilize tables to do good and interesting layouts. It was an interesting time as people were looking at all different ways in which to create layouts on the web. And an example of this is an early version of the Wired magazine website from 1998. This is again from the Web Design Museum. You see that tables are all being used to create layouts, and generally you would nest tables inside other tables, make use of lots of spacer GIFs. But things like links are still the basic default colors. Typefaces and colors and so on are more or less also default. So at this point, we still don't have any CSS. Everything is being done inline in the HTML via the attributes that were available. And some of them would work in some browsers and not in others. And it was very difficult to get any kind of a uniform design experience. This kind of changed a bit when we had the first version of CSS. Hakon Lee published the first draft of what he called cascading HTML style sheets in October 1994. And that was a proposal. There were around 10 other proposals for style sheets at this time. But this was the one that was adopted, and it's the one we've kind of had since 1995. This initial proposal was presented at a web conference in Chicago in November 1994. And there were lots of arguments about it. Some people thought, well, we need a full programming type language to do styling on the web. Others were plumping for the exact opposite of a declarative language and a simple declarative format. And it was that simple declarative format that won out. And a big thing that that was driven here was what we've come to know as separation of concerns. And this wasn't a new thing that suddenly came about with CSS suddenly. Tim Berners-Lee, when he invented HTML, was a very strong proponent of separation of concerns. And he believed that browser makers should just create their own ways of styling things and that there shouldn't be some kind of a uniform way to do it. So CSS version 1, just to continue on that, in 1995, the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, became operational. And there was a workshop in Paris in November of that year, or October, I'm not sure the exact month, not important, where style sheets were the main topic, and CSS from this moment on kind of gained its rightful place in the W3C as something to be worked on. Among the participants of this was Thomas Reardon of Microsoft, and he pledged support for CSS in an upcoming version of Internet Explorer, and that happened in August 1996 with Internet Explorer 3, but it was extremely buggy. Netscape then followed suit, and around the same time there was a small company in Norway, I think it's Norway, it's in Scandinavia, called Opera, and they also started to develop CSS. The first browser to fully support CSS was Internet Explorer, and the first browser to support the full CSS2 specification was in fact Internet Explorer 5 for Mac, and that was in the year 2000, and that was also the very last version of Internet Explorer for Mac as Apple went off to develop Safari. Right, so here's a screenshot of a website called Calibre 10,000, also known as the Designer's Lunchbox. And this is from 2003. And it shows what people were doing with these kinds of layouts at that time. Highly complex, but still tying the styling very much to the HTML concerns. As in, there was no layout properties being used here. This is still a table, and it was a combination of Flash tables and CSS. And Calibre 10,000 was really kind of a groundbreaking and highly influential site. It was like an inspiration place for people to learn and to start experimenting with layouts. It very much followed the kind of design style of the time, which was very pixel-based, use of pixel fonts, and a kind of pixel-perfect design that is unfortunately still with us in the minds of some designers. So it created like a whole new user interface language that was very much copied at the time. Now, if we zoom in a little bit, we can see here that there are issue requirements, and what Calibre 10,000 did was each month they would come out with a new issue. And the issue requirements here are IE5, Netscape Navigator 6, Flash, QuickTime not required. Sometimes QuickTime would be required, and they always did this each time. But it was often the case that the way that Netscape and IE would render style sheets was completely different. And often websites were built in two versions to cater for one or the other. It was a fairly painful time. But this site definitely shows the kind of possibilities of HTML and CSS at the time. Okay, following table-based layouts, we started moving towards CSS-based layouts. And there were really two kinds of these. The first one was what was called a fluid layout. And this was sizing in percentages and not pixels. If the screen size changed, the proportion of elements stayed the same. These tended to be really, really wide on large screens, with really, really small columns on narrow screens because the columns didn't rearrange themselves. And it was kind of short-lived and largely lived in more experimental places than personal websites. And things like the CSS Zen Garden, if anyone remembers that. But the important thing here was that it replaced table-based layouts with floats. And this is where we were for a long time. Now, floats were never meant for layout. This is a hack. And it's something that took a long time for us to get away from. At the same time, we also had fixed layouts. And again, we had a fixed width, but this time sizing in pixels, not percentages. The width stayed the same, independently of which screen size or resolution the viewer might have had. And again, we replaced table layouts with floats. I'm just going to go back quickly to this screenshot, and I'm going to zoom into this little thing here that says, which is an ad, Designing with Web Standards by Jeffrey Zeldman. And Jeffrey Zeldman might be well known to you. He's founder of a List Apart, an Event Apart, a Book Apart, etc., and was really at the forefront of designing, and in particular of what were called web standards, or the Web Standards Project, which was launched in 1998, and it coincided with the launch of CSS Level 2. And the important, very, very important thing here was a separation of concerns, HTML for markup, CSS for styling, and float-based layouts, and getting rid of tables. And the book, Designing with Web Standards, was published in 2003. And Zalman, he's wearing a blue beanie on the cover, and there's now a thing called Blue Beanie Day, where you're supposed to be writing your HTML and CSS according to web standards while wearing a blue beanie. Unfortunately, it's in the summer in the Southern Hemisphere, so I don't recommend it, but it is noted and marked every year. And there were two websites at this time in 2001 that kind of kicked off the web standards movements, and they were high profile, big redesigns. And the first one was ESPN. And you can see that there's a slight difference from those earlier table-based layouts we were looking at. And then the second one was Wired Magazine, also in 2001, a complete redesign. And there were lots of articles about how traffic increased and all sorts of validation from analytics around why web standards was a good thing. But this was around for a long time, like 9 years or so. Fixed widths were everywhere. There was, as you may remember from the early days of smartphones, zooming into a website in your browser to read it. And in 2010, Ethan Marcotte came along at an event apart, and he presented on responsive design for the first time. Now, in responsive design, there are just really three tenets to it. The first one is a flexible grid, whereas grids are basically the same as fluid design that I mentioned earlier, but we have better browser support now for web standards, so all browsers should support the same things. And again, we're using percentages instead of pixels. We're using flexible images, which was a really, really big breakthrough, because for the first time we used CSS to resize images. That was a big change. And then the other thing was media queries, which introduced breakpoints and allowed us to now rearrange our layouts based on device widths and heights. And the first real big site that what became like a poster site for responsive design was a redesign of the Boston Globe, which was undertook by Ethan Marcotte himself alongside the Filament Group and a dev company whose name escapes me. And this was in 2011. Now that's a long time ago. If you think about it, the responsive design was first introduced 10 years ago. The anniversary of that talk is, in fact, towards the end of this month. Right, so that's fine. So let's look at like a simple layout like that's floated. And this is the kind of tenet of what we're looking at with floated designs. And this is fine. We can do this quite easily. We set up some percentage widths, say everything's 25%. We subtract some margin. And that's all great. They all flow, and we've got a nice little grid. Until one of those items is not the same height. And then float clearing comes into play and our layout breaks. And of course, we never know what content size in particular height is going to be. And you can't specify a height with responsive design because then it doesn't scale properly. So we have to then go and write some rather nasty CSS in which we go and kind of target certain elements at a certain position in the layout using something like nth of type, and then clear them and give them a margin of 0 so that our grid retains its shape, which is fair enough until we start looking at this on different screen sizes. And then we have to write a media query where we go and change the width, because now we have 3 items rather than 4. And now our different item needs to clear. And one that we cleared before should no longer be clearing. And it starts to get complicated. And then we might have another width size and another breakpoint. And then it becomes really, really tricky. And we're writing all these kinds of nth of type declarations in order to clear our floats properly and keep our grid under control. And this is a very simple example of just, say, a gallery item. And it's kind of hairy. Yeah, we're not having a good time. Maybe we're even weeping silently when we open this on a device and change the orientation or something. So what do we do? Well, probably this. You just go to Bootstrap, yeah, because hey, it's got everything there and we don't need it. So we just download the full 280 kilobytes of CSS or whatever it might be, just so we can get a grid. And then our elation that our grid works properly turns to anger when we realize that we suddenly have to write a CSS specificity moment of 120 to change the color of a button. It's not ideal. And then you also get sarcastic tweets like the following, which of the two possible websites are you currently designing? And this is, not an uncommon complaint that we see around, the web has started to look the same. And to some extent it has. But this is not a criticism of design. It's a criticism rather of the tools that we have at our disposal to do layout. So I think that criticism is misplaced. And it shouldn't be which of the two possible websites are you currently designing, but which of the two are you currently building? Because we are constrained by our tools. Everything is a hack at this point in time. So what if we have a grid like this, which isn't nice and easy and orderly? It has items that overflow each other. We have white space, all these kinds of things. Now you could do it using floats and absolute positioning, but it would be really difficult. And in order to get that to change as viewport sizes change, you're writing a lot of media queries. You're doing a lot of nth of type things. You have a ton of class names, and it's not particularly easy. But fortunately, we have now a new CSS layout, and this makes these things a lot easier. So let's have a look at components of the new layout. Now, time obviously is not on our side, so I can't go through all of them. So I'm just going to pick out a few from the following list and run through them, and we can see how these can make our lives a lot easier. So the first thing you've probably heard of is Flexbox, and the second thing you've probably heard of is CSS Grid, and these are ways to lay out items on the page. Important, Grid does not replace Flexbox. I know it got support a lot later, was spec'd later, and Flexbox has been around for quite a while now, but they are complementary. One doesn't cancel out the other. You can have grid items inside Flexbox containers, and you can have Flexbox items inside grid containers, and vice versa. I already did vice versa. Never mind. Okay, then the other things we also have is alignment. So now it's a lot easier to align our elements. We have what is called intrinsic sizing, where we can specify sizes based on parents a lot easier. We have logical properties such as padding start, block padding, block end, etc., which are replacing our normal padding and margin properties, and also inline sizing and block sizing to replace width and height. We have object fit, which allows us to say what should happen with images, something we've had in CSS for a long time, like background size cover and things like that. We can now do in HTML. And we have writing modes, which allow us to change orientation from left to right, right to left, vertical, top to bottom, etc. And we have shapes and masking, where we can now make text flow around objects that aren't just a rectangle. And of course, we have all the other CSS properties we've always used, which we shouldn't throw away. They are still very useful. Positioning, we can still float items, but just use float for what it's intended. And all the things we have around color, backgrounds, text, and fonts. Okay, so let's look at Flexbox first. So Flexbox is designed for layout in one dimension, i.e. a row or a column. And by default, it is a row. So we might have some elements, if we set flex on the parent, they will automatically line up next to each other. And we can also do column, where they would line up one underneath each other. So simple example, let's say we have a site header with a little menu and a login button, and we would have an HTML structure like this. And you can already see that our HTML is way less complicated than it might have been if we were using floats. And a few lines of CSS to create that on our container. We align our items to the center. We display it flex. We say flex wrap wrap, which means when the screen size changes, the items will automatically line up underneath each other. And our login, to push it to the right, we just give it a margin left of alter. So that's how easy Flexbox makes doing that kind of a header. So we're already saving tons of time and effort in our HTML and in our CSS. So a real world example from something we designed for one of our clients, a bunch of cards. Those are all using Flexbox. And you can see they're the same height, because Flex will automatically make items the same height. Doesn't matter what their content is. And we can do alignment of buttons, for example, without having to add any padding or margin or anything to them, just by using Flex alignment properties, which I will get to in a few minutes. Another example here, 2 cards as well, and you'll notice that the time to read item at the bottom are aligned, even though the content of the 2 cards is different heights. And again, that's using our Flex properties to make sure they're always at the bottom without having to apply margins to them. So Flexbox is very useful for items we have that are different sizes and that we need to create nice alignment with. Grid, on the other hand, creates a 2-dimensional system for CSS, whereas Flexbox is either column or row. It doesn't work well for 2 dimensions. Grid is specifically 2-dimensional. So, and you can use it to lay out major areas of page, or you can use it just for small interface elements. And Grid started life in 2011 already. It's a proposal sent to the CSS working group from Microsoft. It took a long time to get into browsers, but as of, about a year ago, we have support everywhere. We even have support in IE11, although it uses a different syntax. We can still use Grid there. So what is a grid? So a grid is an intersecting set of horizontal and vertical lines. One defines your columns and one defines your rows. And we can place elements onto the grid respecting those rows and column lines. Features of grid. So we have a fixed and a flexible track size. So you can create a fixed size using pixels, or you can create flexible sizes with percentages. You can use the new FR unit, which I'll speak about. You can use Ms, you can use rems, you can use characters. It really doesn't matter. And you can mix these up as well. You can place items into a precise location because you get line numbers that are created by your grid, and you can therefore target something. So you can say, I want this item to start, on the 4th column, and I want it to span over 2 rows. And you can easily do that. And you can create an explicit grid where you say it's so many columns and so many rows, or an implicit grid where the grid will just automatically expand based on the content inside that container. We also have alignment control like we have with Flexbox. So we can, once the items are placed, we can indicate both how they're aligned in the grid and how their content is aligned within those children. We can place more than one item in a grid cell, and we can control overlapping with Z-index, something that we needed some horrible absolute positioning to do prior to this. Creating a grid is pretty simple. Display grid or display inline grid. And as soon as we do that, all direct children of that element become grid items. Then we can specify columns and rows with the grid template columns and grid template rows property. So in this case, we're saying, give me 3 columns, make them 200 pixels each, and give me 2 rows and make them 200 pixels each. But as I say, you can use any unit of measure within those CSS properties. So that previous example would give us something like this. So we define a grid, and you'll see that we have 3 columns and we have 2 rows. Now, it's important to note that when we define a grid, we define tracks, and not lines. So we've got 3 columns, but we've got 4 column lines. We've got 2 rows, but we've got 3 row lines. And we place items onto the track, not onto the line. So if we wanted something to go to column 2 and row 2, we need to specify 2 to 3 for our row and 2 to 3 for our column. So if we get back to like a complicated grid item that we had before, once we look at it in terms of creating a grid, here has 5 rows and 5 columns, we can go and place items wherever we want on that in the following way. And they can take up as much space as we like. We can position them wherever we want to, and we can overlap any elements that we might want, which is very useful. And we do this by saying grid column start and grid column end, grid row start, and grid row end. And there are shortcut properties for this, many shorthand properties. I'm not going to go into all of them now. They're well documented. We can, for example, say, grid row 1 and span 1. Just go over 1 row, or grid column 2 and then span 2 columns. So go over 2 columns. So that's a very simple way of setting up a grid. And as I say, there are lots of combinations that you can use with these, from shorthand properties to named areas and so on. And just time precludes us going into all of those. Right, so grid, I mentioned this already, and grid introduces a new unit of measure, which is the FR unit. And this is the flexible unit. And it's not, the FR stands for fractional unit. It's not a length unit like a pixel. It is a flexible length unit. So it's a different type of dimension, and it's specific only for grid layout. And we can't combine it, for example, in calc or something like that with, say, m's. You couldn't do calc 1fr minus 2m. That's not allowed. But you can mix FR units with fixed units in your grid layout, and you can also mix it with relative units in your grid layout. And 1FR is equal to 1 part of the available space, and that is the available space of the viewport if you don't have a fixed width container. If you do have a fixed width container, it is a fractional length, 1 part of the available space of the parent. So we might be able to do something like this. We can say div display grid template columns 3 rem, 1fr, 1fr. That means our one on the left, our first column, is always going to be 3 rem, while our second and third column are going to be equal, and they are going to be taking up 50% each of the remaining space. Now you could say 3 rem, 2fr, 2fr, and you would get the same kind of structure, or you could do 3 rem, 1fr, 4fr to create these kinds of flexible units that are going to scale as the viewport unit scales, because the container will scale. So we're getting away from responsive design here, and because we need less and less media queries as we start to work with these new CSS layout properties. Right, so we can also create auto grids and gaps. And this is really where responsive layouts without media queries come into their own. The repeat function allows you to repeat columns as many times as needed. So if you want 12 columns and you know more or less what the width of that content's going to be, you can just go repeat 1fr, for example, and it will fill as many columns as you require for the width of your content that is a child of your grid container. We also have min-max, so we can say you may not be smaller than this, but you may not be bigger than another value. And we can, again, mix things up here. So you could say, don't make this smaller than 200 pixels, but don't make it bigger than 600. And your content will obey those rules. And then we have auto fit and auto fill properties. Auto fit fills the row with as many columns as it can fit, while auto fit fits the currently available columns into a space by expanding them so they take up any available space. Okay, so slightly different and have different use cases. And then a very exciting thing that we have with grid is the grid gap property. And this places spaces between elements. And you can do column gaps or row gaps, or grid gap will apply everywhere, or you can do specifically for your columns and your rows. Now, this is also supposed to work with Flexbox. Currently, it only works with Flexbox in Firefox, and there's been an open ticket on Chrome for a long time about implementing this for Flexbox, but there doesn't seem to be any movement on it. What it does mean is we don't need to worry about margins anymore between our children. We just set a grid gap and off we go. And your grid gap can be any unit of measure. You can use pixels, you can use rems, you can use percentages, you can use ems, you can use characters, you can use any CSS unit of measure. So you might do something like this, like let's have a main div, let's have a display grid, and let's say on our grid template columns repeat. So we're saying just create as many as you can. Auto fill, so fill them up as much as you can. And then let's have a min max. My min max needs to be 250, so it can't be smaller than that. And my maximum needs to be 1FR. So just make up the rest of the space. And then we have a grid gap of 1 rem. And then a very simple kind of grid of images that now gives us that, where we're just saying, keep this width and move across the screen until you can't fill it up anymore. And if we resize the screen on this, I don't have a nice video of that, unfortunately, but if we resize our screen, you'll see that now we have, whereas here we have 8 columns. I've resized the screen, and now we have 3, and everything just flows. There's no media query, no media queries involved here at all, because of our fractional unit, which is flexible, and our auto-fill property. And when we get right down to a really small viewport, everything just stacks one under the other, but no media queries involved. So that's very powerful and a very useful thing that we are now starting to do with Grid. If you use Flexbox and Grid a lot in your layouts, you find you're writing very, very few media queries because you no longer really need them. Okay. Now, an important thing with a new CSS layout I alluded to earlier is box alignment. And box alignments allow us to align our items in our Flexbox container, our Flex items, our grid container, and our grid items. Now, I'm sure you've heard this, there are only 2 hard things in computer science, which is naming things and cache invalidation. I'm going to add a third, and that's vertically and horizontally centering elements in CSS. Now, this has been a pain for a long, long time, and there are all sorts of hacks, like display table cell and transform 50% and so on and so on. Just to do something like that, with the new alignment, box alignment model, it's really, really easy. It's just 2 lines of CSS, align center and justify content center. Now, you can obviously only do this once you change the display property. In this case, display flex. And there's an even easier way to do it. You can just say display flex margin auto, and your items will be vertically and horizontally aligned. Now, I just picked that one out because it's one that comes up a lot of people have always complained about vertically and horizontally centering items. Now it's trivial. But that's not the only thing you can do with alignment. There are, in fact, 3 types of alignment. There's position alignment, which gives us keywords such as start, end, and center. There's baseline alignment, which aligns to baseline, last baseline, and first baseline. And then there's distributed alignment, which space between and space around, space evenly, and so on. And those all work with align items, align content, justify content, and justify items. I'm not going to go into all of these. There are a lot of them. Rachel Andrew, I've put a link there, has a really excellent write-up on all of these alignment properties. Okay, then one of the things that's really important to the new layout is we have all these properties, flex, grid, et cetera, What they really are doing is they're giving us something that we can call intrinsic sizing. And what does that mean? So extrinsic versus intrinsic dimensions. So CSS sizing level 3, and this was a long time ago, introduced the concept of intrinsic dimensions, the opposite of extrinsic. An extrinsic dimension of a box is always calculated on the box's parent box. So if something's 900 pixels wide and it's sitting inside its parent, if a parent is 906 wide, what's in it is a block element, it's 900 pixels wide. So let we say make it 80%. It's extrinsic because it's dependent on the height, on the width of the parent, or its containing box. Now, intrinsic sizing introduces sizing that makes something the properties of the box itself. Okay. So in CSS flow, the classic kind of CSS layout, height 100% doesn't really have any effect on anything, on an item, only if we don't define a height in the parent. So if we want something to be 600 pixels high, we have to define it. We have to specifically give it a height. Height 100% isn't going to do us anything. It's only going to be as high as its moment. So the intrinsic sizing introduces kind of 4 concepts, which is min content, max content, fit content, and stretch. And max content, which we can specify as a width or a max width or a min width, is the intrinsic preferred width. Min content is the intrinsic minimum width, and fit content says fit this to the parent. So these allow us to create sizing based on the content rather than the parent. Okay, and that's a very important distinction. So it means that our layouts become much more adaptable and responsive to both viewports and to layout properties. I've included stretch there, but that is actually part of level 4 of the box alignment, and it's not supported anyway. So all of this is ushered in something that we can call the era of intrinsic design. Okay, and this is a term coined by Jen Simmons, who some of you might know. She's done an enormous amount of work writing about Flex and Grid. And we have a lot of things that we can talk about when we're talking about in the era of intrinsic design. So there are a few things that are important to it, and that's flexibility, that our items contract and expand on the screen, that they wrap and they reflow all the time, that we now have access to negative space, which was very difficult before, which we can add or we can remove based on our designs. We can align any way we like with the box alignment spec. We can size images in HTML to always fit their container using object fit properties. And we grow and shrink at separate rates based on our parent's display property. Unlike responsive design, where everything kind of flows at the same time, and we have jumps as they do that, with the new CSS layout and intrinsic design, we are cutting back on our need for media queries, and flowing and reflowing and wrapping are an intrinsic part of the way in which these properties work, not something that we have to force in as a media query. So we have no or less media queries. And the days of designing for an Android viewport and an iOS viewport and an iPad and a desktop should be on their way out. And we should be designing at a component level and not at a page level, as these new properties allow us to do that. So for the first time, layout's now an integral part of CSS. It's no longer a hack, and it's something that is baked into the language itself. And we no longer have to resort to all sorts of craziness to create a layout. So to end off, I think there are 3 things that are changing the web and the way that we build for it and the possibilities that we have on the web. And the first one is Service Worker and the Service Worker API that allows us to bring app-like experiences to the browser. The second one is variable fonts, and I talk about this a lot, and this is really a way to improve typography and allow our type to flow with the screen as it should. And then the third one is what I've been talking about, which is CSS layout. So the web is a fluid medium, and it's always been a fluid medium. If you go to that very first website that I showed you and you resize your browser, the content flows with your resizing. it is responsive, it is fluid, it wraps, it reflows, it rearranges based on your screen size. And we kind of broke that for a while as we started moving to fixed widths and all these float layouts and all hacks that we tried to do. And we broke it also with responsive design. But we need to embrace the fact that the web is a fluid medium, and we shouldn't be trying to fit it into outdated modes of design. And to make things that thrive in any context, we must accept that fact, that the web is fluid, that we embrace that, and embrace it via using these new CSS layout properties. And that's it. Thanks for listening. If there are any questions, you're welcome to ask them via the Ant Farm question pop-up. Otherwise, I'll be in the Slack channel if anyone has any queries or questions.